Dr. Ben Bikman. Fermenting grains may help some, but overall, grains drive chronic disease.
My view on it, if someone wants to invoke a historical context or defense of grains, my response is, well, then eat it the way our ancestors did, which would have been a very different plant than, say, wheat is. We have changed wheat over time to have much more starch in it and much more gluten and other molecules as well, and phytic acids included. So these are not healthy changes. Also, we've changed how we bake them or use these grains. Once upon a time, almost all of our consumption of grains would have had some form of fermentation, because we would have had to we wouldn't have had all the clever ingredients and chemicals we do to prevent things from spoiling. And we wouldn't have had rapid acting yeasts to accelerate the growth of whatever we were baking, whatever we were making with the wheat. So once upon a time, if we wanted that growth, we would have had to let it sit, and the bacteria would have done all that fermenting and producing all of that gas. So when bacteria are in the fermented dough or the grain, it's eating the starches and then releasing gas. And that gas is what's, of course, inflating the dough. So the one thing about the fermented grains, the bacteria have done some of the work of digestion for us. But when you have bacteria that are eating the starch, then that's less starch we have to eat and digest and absorb. So the actual glucose load from a fermented bread compared to a real whole grain bread, even if they're both whole grain, fermented versus not, we get much less glucose because the bacteria have literally eaten some of the glucose for us, and in the process released a gas, which is allowing the bread or the dough to rise, and it's released short chain fats. That's the byproduct of bacteria eating starches. And the short chain fats are not only a metabolic benefit to us, but they're also part of what gives the sourdough its, in my mind, a particularly pleasant tart flavor, because short chain fatty acids are tart by their very nature. Also, independent of the reduction in glucose that comes from fermenting like a true sourdough, you have a reduction in phytic acids. So the process of digestion actually will, or fermenting, will reduce the phytic acids by up to about 60%. And phytic acids, these are really, so remember, they're blocking the absorption of essential molecules and nutrients in the form of protein. And so we're getting more of what we actually might want from that whole grain. Actually, and if the whole grain, has more minerals than a refined grain, and it does, well, then all the more reason to try to cut those phytic acids down to get more of those. And one other comment about gliadin, and I have this study is also attached. Gliadin is a molecule, of course, that we eat and gets from our guts into our blood, and that can end up in mom's breast milk at significant levels. So when mom is eating this gliadin, she's giving it to her baby, and that might start to, I'm speculating a little here, but I can't help but wonder if that might be part of the growing sensitivity that kids are having at younger and younger ages. It's because they're literally getting it from their very first days as it's moving from mom's diet into mom's milk and then now into baby's diet. So in sum, if I were to focus on a few key takeaways on how whole grains are not the magic food, let alone superfood that many people would like to claim, one is that we have a genuine reduction in our ability to absorb nutrients and proteins, or well, I should say macronutrients in the form of protein and micronutrients in the form of minerals like magnesium, copper, zinc, and calcium. We can have an inflammatory response to some of the components of these whole grains, like to gliadin. And lastly, we're going to have a significant insulin response. And I end with insulin just because it's in my wheelhouse and it's so relevant to overall health. When you eat a whole grain versus a refined grain, the actual insulin response is shockingly similar. People would be very disappointed to see, and wearing something like a continuous glucose monitor really helps reveal that. You look at what happens to your glucose, knowing that your insulin is essentially following a similar line. You're going to have a significant insulin response, even to the so-called healthy whole grains, and insulin matters. Chronically elevated insulin is a much better predictor of a heart attack than cholesterol level, than LDL or total cholesterol. Chronically high insulin is going to drive other pathologies like hypertension through distinct mechanisms, fatty liver disease, infertility, Alzheimer's, and accelerate certain forms of cancer, if not cause them, accelerate them.
Dr. Bikman says, if you insist on eating grains, then eat them the way our ancestors did. We have changed wheat over time. Today, wheat has much more starch, gluten, and phytic acids. We have changed how we bake them. In the past, we would have fermented them because we did not have the chemicals to prevent spoilage, and we did not have rapid-acting yeasts. Our ancestors used bacteria to do the fermenting, and the bacteria helped by eating starches, and the bacteria release gas that helps the dough to grow. Bacteria have done some of the digestion for us, so glucose load from fermented bread is much less. And because bacteria have eaten some glucose for us and release gas and short-term fats that help our metabolism, give the bread its tart flavor, and reduce phytic acids by as much as 60%. Phytic acids block absorption of essential molecules and nutrients, so fermenting, by reducing the phytic acids, allows more nutrients to be absorbed. Actually, whole grains do have more nutrients than refined grains. Gliadin, the molecule that moves from the gut into the blood, gets into mom's breast milk in significant levels, so it may be causing the trend in growing sensitivity in children to gliadin. Summary: whole grains are not the magic health foods that we've been told. Why? Because they, 1, reduce our ability to absorb macronutrients, proteins, and micronutrients, minerals. 2, they can give us an inflammatory response to gliadin. And 3, will have a significant insulin response. Eating whole grains versus refined grains. It's interesting that the insulin response is shockingly similar in both of these. So, the glucose also spikes. Insulin does matter. Chronically elevated insulin is a much better predictor of heart attack than cholesterol or LDL levels, and causes hypertension, fatty liver disease, infertility, even Alzheimer's, and it drives certain types of cancer.